The rain drizzled down on Buckingham Palace, soft but persistent, turning the cobblestones into slick mirrors and dampening the polished boots of the lone figure standing in the archway. Lance Sergeant Callum Fraser, his rifle gripped tightly and diagonally across his chest, stood still like a statue, unmoving, his eyes fixed ahead. Despite the weather, the silence, and the emptiness around him, Fraser's posture remained flawless, his composure unbroken. This was his duty, a duty he had been trained for, a duty that transcended time, fame, and fleeting moments of mockery. Fraser's quiet but powerful presence went unnoticed by most, but not by Prince Harry. As the sleek Jaguar pulled into the courtyard, Harry's tall, ginger-bearded figure emerged from the passenger side. He adjusted his coat against the rain, but his steps were deliberate, as if he were trying to convey a carelessness that he didn't quite own. Behind him trailed a lone aide, clipboard in hand, unsure how to act. Harry scanned the courtyard lazily, not acknowledging the guards or the ceremony, but when his eyes landed on Fraser, there was a brief flicker of recognition, a flash of resentment. The prince didn't smile or nod, instead, he muttered under his breath to his aide, "Still running this charade, are they?" His words hung in the air, unspoken mockery aimed at the stoic figure in red. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below to let me know which country you're watching from. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. Fraser didn't flinch. His gaze didn't move. There was no break in his stance, no change in the measured cadence of his breathing. Harry's footsteps echoed louder as he passed Fraser, but the words he threw into the air landed with weight, like discarded cigarette ash falling onto the wet stones. "You know what I used to call these guys?" Harry continued, his voice rising slightly. "Parade props." His words lingered in the air like smoke, but Fraser remained unmoved. The rain fell harder, but nothing shifted in Fraser's stance. The guard stood tall, his face like granite, his body like a monument, unfazed by the prince's jabs. Harry circled around Fraser now, his tone shifting, more contemptuous. As he began to dissect the meaning of Fraser's role in this royal display. "Imagine wasting your life standing still for a family that doesn't even care about you," Harry scoffed, his words a quiet insult, but Fraser didn't flinch. He remained locked in place, a figure of unyielding discipline. In the silence that followed, Harry grew more impatient, testing the boundaries of Fraser's stillness, trying to provoke a reaction. "All the saluting, all the silence," Harry continued. "Makes them feel like soldiers, doesn't it?" He smirked, as if the idea of loyalty itself was a joke. Fraser stood still, silent and unwavering, each word from Harry dissolving in the rain before they could make any real impact. The drizzle intensified, but Lance Sergeant Callum Fraser's composure never wavered. Standing as he did, with the perfect posture expected of the Queen's Guard, it seemed as though time itself was irrelevant to him. He had been trained for moments like this, unmoving in the face of mockery, coldness, or even anger. It was more than just protocol, it was about something deeper, something unspoken. Fraser was a man defined by his dedication, by the certainty that duty was something to be upheld regardless of circumstance. Behind him, Prince Harry's voice grew sharper, still aiming to provoke. "Wasting your life, standing here for nothing," he sneered. But Fraser's stillness, his unbroken posture, sent a message far louder than any words could. It wasn't just about the uniform or the tradition. It wasn't even about the royal family. Fraser wasn't standing for praise or recognition. He was standing because someone had to. His rifle, polished to a gleam and resting diagonally across his chest, had no magazine, no ammunition. But it was still a weapon. A symbol of discipline, not just for show. His comrades, men who had fought beside him in far harsher conditions, understood that Fraser's real strength lay not in his ability to march or salute, but in his stillness. Even in combat, Fraser had stood firm in the face of danger, unshaken by the explosion of chaos around him. During his second tour, when an IED struck their forward operating base, Fraser didn't flinch. While his comrades ducked for cover, he stood tall, methodically returning fire until reinforcements arrived. He had earned the nickname the Pillar among his unit for his unwavering calm under fire, for his ability to remain unbroken when everything else was falling apart. No one who had served with him was surprised when he was selected for the prestigious role of Queen's Guard. This role, though ceremonial, was one Fraser embraced with the same quiet intensity that defined his service. There was something purposeful about it, a sense of permanence in a world that valued nothing beyond the temporary. Princeharry, walking through the courtyard, could sense the tension in the air. His mocking words seemed to have no effect on Fraser. As Harry circled closer, he grew bolder, his insults more pointed. "Imagine," he mused, "standing here all day like a mannequin, your entire existence boiled down to standing still in front of tourists." His words were meant to sting, to break the guard's composure. But Fraser didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge Harry's presence beyond the most cursory glance. Harry's frustration grew. He could feel the atmosphere shift, could see how the guard's complete indifference seemed to make his mockery feel hollow, impotent. He sneered, "You think this means something, don't you? This uniform? This post? It's all theater. It's all a show for tourists." Harry's voice was dripping with disdain, as though the very idea of duty had become a farce in his eyes, but still, Fraser remained silent. He hadn't shifted his gaze, hadn't moved a muscle. His rifle was still cradled in the same exact position. His posture as perfect as it had been when Harry first arrived. This unshakable stillness, this quiet defiance, spoke volumes. Harry paused, watching Fraser closely. His words took on a quieter edge, laced with bitterness and frustration. "I used to be one of you," Harry murmured, almost to himself. "I wore that uniform. I did the drills. I saluted the gates. And now look at me." He turned, shaking his head. "Guess we all outgrow it eventually," but Fraser didn't respond. He didn't need to. The words meant nothing in the face of duty, and Harry knew it. Something had shifted in the prince's expression, maybe a faint realization of just how hollow his words had become. For a brief moment, Harry looked vulnerable, like a man trapped between the memory of his past and the disillusionment of his present. The silence between them deepened. Harry stared at Fraser, his eyes studying the guard more closely now, as if searching for a crack, something he could exploit. But there was nothing. No emotion. No reaction. Just the same unwavering presence, rooted deeply in the past, unyielding in the face of the present. Harry stepped closer to Fraser, his boots tapping loudly on the wet stones beneath them. He was frustrated, a sense of helplessness creeping in. It was as if no matter what he said, no matter how hard he tried to break the man standing before him, he couldn't make him move, couldn't make him react. Fraser remained a pillar of stone, unwavering and unmoved, despite the growing tension in the air. The prince continued his verbal assault, but now his words were more pointed, sharp with a hidden bitterness. "I wonder," he began, slowing his pace as he walked in a small circle around the guard. "How long would you stand there if I just kept talking? All day? All week? What's the point of pride if no one's even listening?" Harry's voice had softened. His tone becoming quieter, almost reflective. Yet, Fraser did not flinch. His eyes never shifted, his posture never sagged. "You're still standing here, aren't you?" Harry mused, his tone almost taunting now, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "For a family that doesn't even know you exist. It's all theater. All this saluting, all this silence. It's just a costume, a relic of the past." But Fraser, as always, didn't react. The silence between them was suffocating, yet for the guard, it was simply a part of his duty. Fraser didn't need to defend the royal family, didn't need to justify his presence or his commitment to a cause. His actions spoke louder than any words. He stood not for applause or validation but out of a quiet, unshakable sense of responsibility. Harry's frustration reached its peak, and he stopped in front of the guard, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You hear me?" he asked, his voice carrying a sharper edge. "You still think this means something?" But still, Fraser didn't answer. He stood tall, a silent testament to something deeper, something beyond the reach of Harry's mockery. There was an unmistakable weight in the air now, as though Harry's words had lost their power. The rain had begun to fall more heavily, but Fraser remained unaffected, his uniform gleaming despite the damp. He wasn't trying to prove anything, he simply existed in that moment, a living embodiment of duty, and yet, for all of Harry's attempts to provoke a reaction, it was Fraser's silence that spoke loudest. The rain began to fall harder, splashing off the stones around them, but neither man moved. Harry was still standing close to Fraser now, his body just feet away, a figure of agitation in contrast to the guard's stillness. But as much as Harry wanted to provoke a response, he couldn't help but feel something shift within him. Fraser's quiet composure had begun to wear at him in a way he hadn't expected. Each moment of silence was a subtle reminder of everything Harry had walked away from: duty, loyalty, discipline, and above all, the idea of service. Harry had once worn the same uniform, stood in those very shoes, and understood the weight of responsibility that came with it. But over time, disillusionment had crept in, and the man who once proudly served had become the man who questioned the very system he had devoted himself to. "You're not a soldier anymore, Harry," he whispered to himself under his breath, though it was barely audible. "At least not in the way you used to be." The realization stung. And for a brief moment, the facade of the rebellious prince began to crack. The man standing before him wasn't just any guard. He wasn't just a mannequin in a red tunic. He was something more, something Harry had once been, but had lost sight of over time. Fraser's silence was not a sign of obedience. It was a sign of something deeper, something Harry hadn't understood. It was a quiet defiance, a quiet conviction. It wasn't about following orders or standing still because it was expected. It was about standing firm in a world that was constantly changing, in a world that demanded more and more of individuals like Fraser, yet offered little in return. The prince took a step back, his eyes studying Fraser more closely now. The older man's jaw was set, his posture perfect, and yet, there was something else in the way he held himself, a quiet strength that came not from a need for approval, but from a sense of duty that was unshakable, even in the face of mockery. Harry didn't know what to say next. The silence between them had become deafening. Harry paused, standing a few feet from the motionless figure of Lance Sergeant Fraser. The rain continued to fall, but it seemed to slow in its intensity. As if the storm in Harry's mind was beginning to settle, if only for a moment. He had pushed, he had provoked, and yet, Fraser's silence remained unwavering. Frustrated, Harry took a step closer, his voice low but sharp. "You really believe in all this, don't you?" His words were no longer filled with the bitterness they had once carried, instead, they were tinged with a quiet resignation. He wasn't just questioning Fraser's loyalty to the royal family anymore. He was questioning his own path, his own choices. Fraser didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. The question had been asked, and the response had already been given. It was in the stillness, in the calm, in the unwavering discipline that Fraser exhibited. There was no need for words when your actions spoke louder than anything you could say. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Fraser's voice broke the silence. His tone was quiet, measured, and calm. "Belief isn't needed, sir. Only respect." The simplicity of his words hit Harry like a punch to the gut. It wasn't about faith or pride or blind loyalty. It was about respect, for the uniform, for the duty, for the service. The words were so simple, so precise, yet they carried a weight that Harry hadn't expected. Respect for what, exactly? Harry asked, but there was no real anger in his voice now, only curiosity, a searching for something he hadn't been able to find in himself for a long time. Respect, Fraser replied, his voice still steady, "for those who hold the line, even when others walk away." The words hung in the air between them, a final, quiet challenge. Harry opened his mouth as if to say something, but he didn't. He couldn't. Fraser had said everything that needed to be said. For the first time in the conversation, Harry's expression shifted. There was no defiance left in his gaze, only the faintest trace of recognition. Maybe it was a fleeting moment of understanding, a realization of the conviction he once had, but had lost somewhere along the way. Maybe it was just a glimmer of the man he used to be, standing face to face with the man who never walked away. The rain, which had seemed relentless only moments ago, now felt like a distant background to the real storm unfolding in Harry's mind. Fraser remained silent, his posture as perfect as ever. The moment stretched on, the weight of Fraser's quiet conviction filling the air. The silence between them deepened. Harry stood there, eyes locked on Fraser, but his mind was racing. He was no longer certain of what he was trying to prove. The words he had thrown at Fraser, words filled with disdain, mockery, bitterness, now felt hollow. They no longer had the power they once did. It was as if the more Harry tried to provoke a reaction, the more he was reminded of how little he truly understood the commitment and discipline Fraser represented. Harry's gaze dropped briefly, his boots pressing into the wet stones beneath him as the rain fell more steadily now, soaking his coat and hair. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on him. He wasn't just standing here trying to break the guard's resolve anymore, he was grappling with his own inner turmoil. The prince wasn't just mocking Fraser's loyalty, he was questioning his own path, his own decisions. He had walked away. He had turned his back on everything he had once sworn to protect, and now, standing in the presence of a man who embodied all the things Harry had left behind, the prince began to wonder whether he had made the right choice. The irony was not lost on him. He, who had once been part of the military, part of the family that had served the nation, now felt a sense of emptiness he couldn't ignore. Fraser, standing before him, had found a way to hold on to his sense of duty. For Harry, it was no longer about honor or service, it was about disillusionment. He had thought that walking away would give him freedom. But now, in this moment, he wasn't so sure. Fraser had not moved an inch. His rifle was still held perfectly across his chest, his posture just as firm as it had been when Harry first arrived. His silence spoke volumes, but it was also a reflection of something Harry had lost long ago, purpose. Harry opened his mouth as if to speak, but nothing came out. He closed it again, his expression softening. What could he say? How could he justify his own abandonment of a duty he once held sacred? The question lingered, unanswered, as the rain continued to fall between them, amplifying the gravity of the silence that had taken over the courtyard. Fraser stood, unbroken, in the face of Harry's silent struggle. The guard's stillness was more than just a physical posture, it was a statement of character, a symbol of his unwavering belief in the duty he had sworn to uphold. And though Harry's frustration had clearly been mounting, Fraser wasn't about to engage in a battle of words. He didn't need to. His silence, his composure, spoke louder than anything Harry could say. Harry had, at one point, worn the same uniform, walked the same path, and understood the weight of responsibility it carried. But now, he was a man lost in the fog of disillusionment. He had left the uniform behind, walked away from the family and the service that had defined him for so long. And standing before Fraser now, it felt as though he was confronted by everything he had abandoned, but Fraser wasn't about to let his composure slip. He hadn't moved an inch, not when Harry had mocked him, not when Harry had questioned the very essence of the work he did. There was a quiet authority in his demeanor that was almost impenetrable. It wasn't born of arrogance or pride, it was born of an unshakable belief in his purpose. When Harry's harsh words cut through the air, Fraser's response was simple and firm. "Sacrifice doesn't end when you step off the battlefield, sir," he said, his voice steady, the words precise. "Sometimes it begins after." The statement hit Harry like a punch to the gut. It was as if Fraser had peeled back the layers of his defense and exposed the raw truth, leaving behind the uniform, leaving behind the service, had not freed him. It had only left him with a deeper, more painful sense of loss. Harry had served in Afghanistan, had buried friends, had fought in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. He had once known what it meant to sacrifice, to put everything on the line for something greater than himself. But now, in this moment, he was faced with a realization that left him speechless. His decision to walk away had not been an act of bravery, it had been a way of running from a reality he didn't want to face. Fraser's quiet words had pierced through Harry's layers of defense. The simplicity of them, "Sacrifice doesn't end when you step off the battlefield," was both a challenge and a reminder. Harry wasn't just questioning Fraser's loyalty. He was questioning his own. And for the first time in this conversation, Harry wasn't sure where he stood. The words that Fraser had just spoken hung in the air like heavy fog, thick with meaning. Harry stood there, frozen, his mind processing what had just been said. For a moment, he could feel the weight of the guard's words settling deep inside him. Fraser had said something that Harry couldn't easily brush off. It wasn't just about the military. It wasn't even about loyalty to a family or a cause. It was about sacrifice. And sacrifice, Fraser had reminded him, didn't end when you walked away from the battlefield. Harry had thought that leaving had been the answer. He had believed that stepping away from the royal family, from the life that had been mapped out for him, would give him the freedom he so desperately craved. But now, standing in front of Fraser, that sense of freedom seemed like an illusion. Fraser had known what it meant to sacrifice. He had seen the horrors of war, had lost brothers in arms, and had continued to serve with a sense of duty that Harry, in his disillusionment, had forgotten. The prince had once stood beside men like Fraser, but somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of what that loyalty meant. He had replaced it with anger, bitterness, and a belief that he was better off without it. But Fraser had never abandoned his post, never turned his back on the duty he had sworn to uphold. And in that silence, in that stillness, he had shown Harry something he hadn't seen in years, what it meant to stand for something, to believe in something, to be a part of something greater than yourself. Harry's jaw tightened as he took in Fraser's words, his gaze drifting to the guard's steady form. The anger that had once fueled him was now replaced with something else, something Harry couldn't quite name. Maybe it was respect. Maybe it was regret. Maybe it was a combination of both. But whatever it was powerful. It was the kind of feeling that made him question everything he had walked away from, and for the first time, Harry didn't feel like the one in control of the situation. He didn't feel like the one who had all the answers. In front of him stood a man whose silence spoke louder than any words could, a man who had given everything without expecting anything in return. And Harry, for the first time in a long while, felt like he had lost something precious, something he couldn't get back. The courtyard, once filled with tension and mockery, had grown quiet. And in that quiet, Harry was left to confront the hardest truth of all. He wasn't sure anymore whether walking away had been the right choice. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was a revelation, a silent acknowledgement that duty, loyalty, and sacrifice were not things to be taken lightly. Harry's thoughts swirled in a torrent, a storm of self-reflection that he couldn't seem to escape. For the first time in the conversation, his tone had shifted, no longer sharp with anger or mockery. There was something deeper now, something quieter, more introspective in his eyes as he stared at Fraser. The guard's unshakable composure had begun to unsettle him, reminding him of everything he had left behind. Fraser, unmoved, stood like a living monument to duty, his posture as perfect as ever, his eyes never wavering. There was a quiet strength in that stillness, something beyond the uniform, beyond the ceremonial role. It was a strength born of sacrifice, not for glory, not for recognition, but simply for the integrity of his commitment. Harry's frustration continued to build, but it was no longer about the guard's silence. It was about his own inability to reconcile what he had walked away from. He had once believed in service, in something greater than himself. But now, standing before Fraser, it felt as though he had abandoned that belief, left it behind along with the uniform. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" Harry asked, his voice quieter now, more vulnerable than it had been before. It wasn't an accusation, but more a question that had been building inside of him for some time. There was no anger in his words now, just a quiet recognition of something he hadn't been willing to confront. He wasn't sure what he expected from Fraser, but what he got in return was the same unyielding silence. Fraser's stillness was not an act of superiority, it was an act of quiet dignity. The kind of dignity that Harry, despite all his experience, had lost along the way. The silence wasn't a denial of Harry's pain or confusion, it was simply a reflection of the guard's unshakable resolve, a resolve built on years of serving something larger than oneself. In that moment, Harry realized that it wasn't just about loyalty to the royal family or the uniform. It was about purpose. Fraser had a purpose that gave meaning to his sacrifice. Harry, on the other hand, was still searching for his. He had walked away from it, thinking it would be easier to live without it, but now, standing in front of Fraser, he saw just how deeply the absence of that purpose had affected him. The silence between them deepened, no longer uncomfortable but filled with the weight of realization. Harry knew, in that moment, that he was still lost in the noise of the world, searching for something that would make him feel whole again. But Fraser didn't need to search. He had found it long ago, in the quiet moments when he stood at his post, in the stillness that spoke louder than any words could. The rain continued to fall, its rhythmic tapping against the courtyard stones the only sound breaking the heavy silence that had enveloped the two men. Prince Harry's gaze softened as he stared at Fraser, but his mind was still whirling. He was no longer sure what he had come here to prove, or whether he even had anything left to prove. He had been angry at the family he had left behind, angry at the system, angry at everything that had once defined him. But standing in front of Fraser, he began to understand that his anger had been misdirected. It wasn't the royal family he was angry with. It was himself. "Why do you still stand here?" Harry asked, his voice quiet now, less mocking, less demanding. There was a note of genuine curiosity in his question, a soft vulnerability that had not been there before. "Why do you keep doing this? What's the point of it?" Fraser's posture didn't shift, and for a moment, Harry thought he might not get an answer. But then, in that calm, measured tone that had come to define the man before him, Fraser spoke. "The point isn't about me, sir," he said. "It's about the line. The line that needs to be held. It's about what I stand for, not whether anyone notices." Harry was silent for a moment, processing the weight of Fraser's words. The guard wasn't just standing still out of duty, he was standing because there was something that needed protecting, something larger than himself. It wasn't about the royal family, or the tourists, or the ceremonies. It was about something more fundamental. It was about discipline, about service, about responsibility. For Harry, this was a revelation. He had spent so much time resenting the idea of duty, of loyalty to a family that he felt had abandoned him, that he hadn't stopped to think about what it really meant to serve. Fraser had shown him that service wasn't about glory or recognition, it was about standing firm when everything else around you is in chaos. It was about holding the line, even when no one else does. The moment felt heavy, charged with unspoken understanding. Harry felt a small shift in his perspective, as though he were beginning to see things in a new light. It wasn't the royal family or the uniform that mattered. It was what those things represented: duty, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to something greater than oneself. The air around them seemed to thicken with the weight of everything that had been said, everything that had been left unsaid. Harry stood there, still processing Fraser's words, as the rain continued to pour. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to come here and be confronted with the stark reality of his own choices, with the quiet, unyielding discipline that Fraser represented. He had thought that walking away from the royal family had been an act of liberation, an act of defiance. But in the face of Fraser's silent conviction, Harry realized just how far he had drifted from the man he had once been, a man who had once proudly worn the uniform, a man who had stood shoulder to shoulder with his comrades and fought for something greater than himself. The silence between them grew longer, but this time it was different. It wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't a silence filled with frustration or mockery. It was a silence filled with understanding. Harry finally spoke, his voice soft but resolute. "I walked away because I thought it would be easier. But I see now that it's not about what's easier. It's about what's right." Fraser didn't respond, but his posture shifted ever so slightly, as if acknowledging the shift in Harry's tone. The prince had taken the first step toward understanding, not just Fraser's commitment, but his own. "I didn't realize," Harry continued, his voice quieter now, almost as if he were speaking more to himself than to Fraser, "that standing still doesn't mean you're not moving forward. It doesn't mean you've given up." He paused for a moment, his words heavy with the realization. "Maybe I've been wrong about a lot of things." The rain had begun to taper off, the gray clouds beginning to break apart, and for the first time in the conversation, Harry felt a sense of clarity. Standing here, facing Fraser, had made him confront a side of himself he had long ignored. It wasn't about abandoning his past, it was about finding a way to integrate it into the man he had become. Fraser remained silent, but in that silence, Harry felt the weight of his words land. It wasn't just about service or loyalty, it was about the respect that comes with standing firm in the face of adversity, about the strength that comes from duty, and the understanding that some things are worth standing for. Even when no one notices, the rain had eased to a fine mist, the droplets hanging delicately in the air, reflecting the faint glimmer of daylight. Harry stood there, his mind swirling with thoughts, yet a sense of clarity had started to settle over him. Fraser's silence, once maddening, now felt like the perfect answer to everything Harry had been struggling with. It wasn't simply a lack of response, it was an answer in itself. An answer Harry hadn't been able to find in himself until now. As Harry stood there, reflecting on everything that had transpired, his gaze softened. Fraser had, in his quiet way, given him a lesson in resilience and purpose. The prince had spent so much time running from his own past, rejecting everything that he once held dear. But now, standing face to face with the embodiment of duty and sacrifice, Harry began to see things differently. "I thought I knew what loyalty was," Harry muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. "I thought I knew what it meant to serve." He paused for a moment, his eyes still fixed on Fraser. "But I was wrong. Loyalty isn't about staying for the applause. It's about staying when no one else will." Fraser didn't speak, of course, but Harry felt a shift in the air, as if the silence had reached a conclusion of its own. The guard's stillness, the calm in his demeanor, was now something Harry understood on a deeper level. Fraser's commitment to his post wasn't about external validation. It wasn't about the royal family, the crowds, or the ceremonies. It was about a personal sense of responsibility, something that transcended everything else. In that moment, Harry finally understood the power of standing firm, not for the recognition, not for the glory, but because someone had to. And maybe, just maybe, that was the lesson he needed most. Harry took one last look at Fraser, his posture as perfect as ever. The scarlet tunic still gleaming despite the persistent drizzle. The courtyard, now quiet and still, seemed to hum with an energy of its own, a sense of purpose that Harry had come to respect in ways he hadn't thought possible only hours earlier. He had come here with one intention, to provoke, to challenge, to perhaps even break Fraser's stillness. But what he had received in return was something far more powerful. Fraser had not fought back, had not tried to explain his actions or his loyalty. He had simply stood there, embodying everything that Harry had once believed in but had since abandoned. The prince took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling in the quiet air, and then he turned away. The decision to leave was not sudden, but it was final. There was no need for more words, no need for further confrontation. He had found something in this moment, something beyond the anger, beyond the resentment he had carried with him for so long. Fraser had shown him that some things in life weren't meant to be questioned. Some things, like duty and loyalty, had a weight that didn't require justification. Harry turned back to his aide, who was standing at a distance, waiting for the signal to leave. The aide had been a silent observer throughout the exchange, his expression unreadable. Harry gave him a small nod, a subtle acknowledgement that things had shifted, but he didn't look back at Fraser again. The Jaguar's engine started up with a soft hum, pulling away from the courtyard without a sound, slipping through the gates and out of sight, leaving behind nothing but the quiet presence of the guard. As the car disappeared, Fraser shifted his shoulders ever so slightly, resetting his posture with a subtle grace. The moment the exchange was over. The guard remained, standing tall. His eyes still fixed on the distance, his presence unwavering, but something had changed. Harry had walked away, not because he was defeated, but because he had come to understand something deeper. In that brief encounter, Fraser had given him more than just a lesson in loyalty. He had reminded him of the importance of standing firm, not because it's easy, but because sometimes, it's the only thing that matters. As the quiet settled back into the courtyard, the rain softened to a gentle mist, and the tourists began to trickle in, snapping photos of the palace and its famous guards. But none of them would ever truly understand the weight of the silence they were witnessing. To them, it was just a show, just a part of the royal spectacle. They would never know what had transpired in that courtyard between Harry and Fraser, but one man did. An older gentleman, with a cane and a set of weathered medals, stood at the barrier near the guard post. He didn't speak, didn't move, but he raised his hand to his temple in a slow, respectful salute. Fraser, of course, didn't acknowledge the gesture, but the subtle dip of his chin showed that he had noticed. There was something unspoken in that moment, a shared understanding between the two men, one who had stood his ground for years, and one who had lived through battles of his own. Behind the veteran, a young boy watched, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Is he a real soldier?" the boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His mother nodded gently, a soft smile on her face. The realest kind. The boy, still unsure of the etiquette, didn't salute, but he straightened his shoulders and lifted his chin in a small act of respect. For a moment, he mimicked the exact posture of the guard. The veteran smiled quietly at the boy but didn't correct him. Sometimes, the lesson wasn't in words. Sometimes, it was in how you stood, how you held yourself when the world around you was in chaos. And as the day went on, the tourists came and went, the news cycle churned on with its usual noise, but in the quiet corners of the courtyard, Lance Sergeant Callum Fraser remained. His rifle, held upright across his chest, his posture unbroken, became a symbol of something much larger than himself. It was a reminder that, even in the midst of a world filled with noise and distractions, there are still those who stand firm, who hold the line without needing recognition, without needing applause. The young boy had learned a lesson that day, without even knowing it. The legacy of quiet loyalty, of standing firm in the face of everything else, was alive and well in that moment. And while the world outside continued to turn, Fraser remained, a living embodiment of something that few people truly understood, and that was enough. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit like and share it. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring videos. Thanks again and see you in the next one.